Hi, this is James Cook of the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'm recording this video at the beginning of the Sociology of Gender course that I teach here to talk about some concerns that students commonly air when I ask them to at the beginning of the semester. I would say the two most common concerns are the sense of feeling overwhelmed and the sense that somehow one might get it wrong, that one might say the wrong words at the wrong time, that one might offend somebody else, or perhaps that one might be offended by somebody else's words. So let's talk about both of them. The sense of feeling overwhelmed is not something that I'm going to actually tell you is wrong and that you shouldn't feel. Feeling overwhelmed happens when we're not sure how to manage a situation. We don't know what's expected of us. And that's what the sociology of gender is all about. It's about taking these categories that we have learned in our society, in our upbringing, are simple, cut and dried, and peeling that apart. So you're going to feel uncomfortable. And sometimes a little overwhelmed by some of the things we take a look at, because that neat dichotomy between a man who is a male on the one hand and a woman who is a female on the other hand is going to break down. And we're going to examine those places and spaces where that dichotomy breaks down. And it's going to feel strange. It's going to feel like you're Neo going into the Matrix, or out of the Matrix into the real world for the first time. So what I can tell you is that the feeling will get better, and that if you're feeling overwhelmed in a kind of a philosophical sense, that's a sign that you're on the right track, actually. Learning to feel uncomfortable, overwhelmed, and sit with those feelings and allow yourself to feel that is one of the best things you can do in this course in particular. The second thing I want to talk about is about words, and I want to do that by telling you the words that we used when I first taught a course. It was called Sociology of Women. It was in 1994, and it wasn't Sociology of Gender. And the reason it wasn't called Sociology of Gender was that the folks who had designed that course that I was teaching for the first time had reckoned that there was a special status of people, a sub-status of people that were separate from everybody else, and those were called women, and they were a special case, and women deserved to have their circumstances looked at. That's not necessarily a problematic choice, but it's a different set of words than we are using today, which is to talk about gender. And there was a big fight when people wanted to introduce a sociology of gender class. They said, we already have a sociology of women class. And this was back in the 90s. It's relatively recent when it comes to history. People didn't see the difference between women and gender. Partially because we took on this Greek idea that in our society that man was the default, the standard, and then there's deviations from that. A strange case to look at, as if men do not also have gender. And that masculinity, the expression of manhood, is not also something that is socially constructed. So the words changed. The words also have changed over a broader scope of time. If you went back to the 1950s, you would find most discussions were regarding sex roles. That is, how is it that people learn how to be good males and females in society? It was seen at that time as relatively unproblematic. The idea that there was one way to be a man or one way to be a woman, and there was the right way and the wrong way, the functional way and the dysfunctional way, and we would study how that worked. We're in a different time, and the words have changed because the way that we have been thinking about things has changed. More recently, really only since 1980, has the term gender come into play as the idea that it's not about this biological thing called sex, it's about this social and cultural set of expectations, beliefs, values, practices, that constitute our ideas of masculinity and femininity and other things. So it's only since 1980 that sociologists have really been using the word gender quite commonly. Even more recently is the use of the idea of cisgender versus transgender identity. Those words you will find if you take a look at published records of books did not really appear commonly until after the turn of the 21st century. So these are new ideas. They are new words. Cisgender, the idea that the gender that you express and identify with are consistent with the sex that you were assigned at birth. Transgender, meaning that your gender identity and expression are not the same as the gender expected for the sex at which you were identified at birth. These are new words. We talked about transgender to break that apart even further before we began to talk about the idea of cisgender, much as the sociology of women appeared before the sociology of gender appeared, because those who are different were studied first, before people said, hey, wait a minute, this idea of normalcy is something new for us too. So it is in this historical moment right now that we are watching that dichotomy of man, woman, masculine, feminine, ideas of behavior and expectations and identity. That dichotomy becoming ripped apart into what looks like a large number of possible gender identities, at the same time that it's becoming untethered from the ideas of male and female as biological dichotomies, at the same time that the male and female dichotomy is itself being torn apart and questioned, and we're finding so many exceptions that perhaps the rule no longer applies. In that environment, it is entirely natural to expect that we will all struggle at times with words, with definitions, with ways of thinking about things. And what I will suggest is that it's important for you to accept that in yourself, even for you to expect that and accept that struggle with your professor, and finally with one another. What can we do to create an environment in which we can talk about this new mode of understanding that opens so many intellectual possibilities and practical, concrete possibilities as well outside of academia? We can be patient with ourselves, and we can be patient with one another. And we can pay attention to the words we use so that we are really careful to learn and put in the work to learn those different definitions and different ways of thinking about those words so that we can learn to be careful. It's like learning a new language. And the best thing you can do to be good at learning a new language is practice. And as people practice, just as in a French class or a German class, it's expected that people will sometimes stumble. So will we. As we stumble, as we learn together, as we examine together, let's promise to be patient. Let's promise to be careful. Let's promise to be thorough. And finally, let's promise one another to pay attention to the difference between what we believe the way the world should be and what we see the way the world actually empirically is. Our observations can take place in a careful manner, a systematic manner, and they can stand by themselves at the same moment that we may, all of us, have certain ways of thinking about what is morally right, morally wrong, proper or improper. This is called the normative, and this is called the empirical. Observations versus judgments. We're going to focus on the empirical over here because it's a lot easier for a group of people to get together and agree on what they see. A lot easier, although still problematic, than agreeing on what should be. A sociology is an empirical approach, is about looking at what we actually do see. So, let's be empirical in how we look at patterns in what is observable in the world. Let's be patient with one another as we learn vocabulary, often vocabulary that is used differently outside of sociology than in sociology. We're all learning a new language. Let's be very clear about when we're talking about the normative and not the empirical. And let's mostly focus on the empirical. And finally, when you are feeling overwhelmed and that feeling becomes perhaps intolerable for the moment, feel free to set the class aside for a moment. That's the lovely thing about being able to have a class online, is that we can work with the course at the times that are best fitting for us within the structure of a week. Keep these in mind and go just as easy on yourself as you go on others, and I hope you'll find that you enjoy the study of the sociology of gender as much as I do.